Before it became a museum, before it became a postcard, before it became a symbol of excess and ambition, this place was a private obsession. High above the Pacific Ocean, on a remote California hilltop, one man attempted to build permanence in a world that was changing faster than he could control. William Randolph Hearst was not simply constructing a residence. He was attempting to outbuild time itself. Stone by stone, ceiling by ceiling, he poured wealth, power, fear, love, and memory into a single location he called the Enchanted Hill. What emerged was not just a castle, but a psychological monument. A reflection of a boy shaped by European grandeur, a media titan driven by influence, and a man haunted by the need to leave something behind that could not be erased. This story is not about luxury alone. It is about obsession, creation, collapse, and the cost of dreaming on a scale the world could not sustain. To understand the castle, you must understand the man who refused to let it ever be finished, William Randolph Hearst. If you want to understand how power tries to make itself eternal, how ambition reshapes landscapes, and why some dreams survive long after the people who built them are gone, stay with us. Subscribe, like, and continue watching as we uncover the full rise, reign, and unraveling of one of the most extraordinary private empires ever created, etched in stone, standing above the sea. He was born into a world already moving at full speed. The 29th of April, 1863. San Francisco was no longer a frontier outpost. It was becoming a city shaped by gold, railroads, speculation, and ambition. Into that environment came William Randolph Hearst, the only child of two people who represented opposite forces of the American dream. His father embodied raw acquisition. His mother embodied refinement and meaning. Between them, they would shape a man who believed power was something you built, displayed, and controlled. George Hearst did not inherit wealth. He pursued it. He moved through mining camps, gambling halls, and lawless towns with the instincts of a survivor. While thousands chased rumors of fortune, he learned how to read land, how to recognize value where others saw dust. His discoveries in Nevada's Comstock Lode and later in South Dakota transformed him from a prospector into a titan. By the time William was old enough to remember anything clearly, his father had already crossed into the realm of the extraordinarily wealthy. Money was no longer a goal. It was a fact of life. Phoebe Apperson Hearst came from a different world. She was educated, curious, and deeply invested in the idea that wealth meant responsibility to culture. She believed exposure to beauty shaped the mind. Art, architecture, literature, and music were not luxuries to her. They were tools for understanding civilization. While George accumulated, Phoebe curated. She filled their home with books, artifacts, and conversation that extended far beyond business or politics. William grew up absorbing both influences without fully belonging to either. He had access to money without needing to earn it. He had access to culture without needing to seek it. From an early age, he learned that scale mattered. That size impressed. That visibility created authority. He was not raised to be cautious. He was raised to think expansively. When William was 10 years old, Phoebe made a decision that would permanently shape his internal compass. She took him to Europe, not for a brief tour, but for nearly 18 months. They moved through England, France, Italy, and beyond, visiting cities whose power had been expressed not through speed or novelty, but through endurance. They walked through castles that had stood for centuries. They entered palaces that had survived wars, revolutions, and changing rulers. William saw architecture that had outlived the men who built it. This was not passive sightseeing. Phoebe explained what they were seeing. She spoke about dynasties, patronage, and the way rulers used art and construction to project legitimacy. William did not yet understand politics, but he understood permanence. He understood that buildings could outlast people, that stone could preserve intention when memory failed. The contrast with America was unmistakable. In Europe, history pressed in from every side. In California, history was still being manufactured. Wealth appeared quickly and disappeared just as fast. Mansions were built, abandoned, and replaced. Nothing felt settled. For a child absorbing these differences, Europe did not just feel older, it felt serious. When William returned to San Francisco, he did not forget what he had seen. He began collecting almost compulsively. Coins, books, art, furniture, anything that carried the weight of age or craftsmanship. His bedroom filled with objects that seemed out of place in a young American's life. This was not play. It was rehearsal. He was surrounding himself with symbols of continuity in a country obsessed with momentum. His parents encouraged different aspects of this behavior. George saw collecting as harmless eccentricity. Phoebe saw it as education. Neither recognized how deeply it was shaping William's sense of identity. He was not merely enjoying beauty. He was learning to equate ownership with meaning. When he entered Harvard, he did not suddenly become disciplined or restrained. He became louder, more visible. He treated the university as a stage rather than an institution. He excelled socially, not academically. He cultivated attention. He disrupted routines. His pranks were elaborate, expensive, and designed to be noticed. He understood instinctively that shock created memory. Harvard did not tame him. It expelled him. The famous chamber pot incident, engraved with professors' names, was less about disrespect than dominance. He was signaling that authority could be mocked, inverted, or ignored. Being removed from Harvard did not humiliate him. It confirmed something he already believed. Rules were flexible when power existed. He returned to California at a moment when his father's interests had expanded beyond mining. George Hearst had acquired a struggling newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, almost as an afterthought. It was not seen as a serious asset. Newspapers were tools, not empires. George offered the paper to his son with minimal expectations. It was, in his mind, a safe distraction. William saw something else entirely. He understood immediately that newspapers did not merely report reality. They framed it. They selected what mattered. They decided which voices were amplified and which were ignored. Unlike mines or railroads, influence through print did not depend on geography. It traveled daily into homes, offices, and conversations. Control the paper, and you could shape perception itself. He transformed the Examiner with a speed that startled older editors. Headlines grew larger. Stories became emotional rather than informational. Crime, scandal, and conflict dominated the front page. He understood that readers did not buy papers for balance. They bought them for feeling, fear, anger, curiosity, excitement. Circulation exploded. William was not interested in restraint. He was interested in reach. Every successful edition reinforced the same lesson. Visibility was power, and power once tasted demanded expansion. By the time his father died in 1891, William inherited more than wealth. He inherited independence. He began acquiring papers across the country, each one reshaped in the same image: loud, emotional, unapologetic. Critics accused him of sensationalism. He dismissed them as irrelevant. The numbers spoke louder than opinions. His move into New York was inevitable. The city was the center of finance, politics, and culture. To dominate American media, he had to dominate New York. When he purchased the New York Journal, he entered a direct war with Joseph Pulitzer. Their competition escalated daily. Bigger headlines, more dramatic stories, faster printing, higher stakes. This rivalry would define an era. Yellow journalism did not emerge accidentally. It was engineered. Hearst understood that exaggeration blurred into belief when repeated often enough. During the Spanish-American War, his papers framed conflict as moral necessity. Whether or not he directly influenced policy, he influenced emotion, and emotion moved crowds. By the turn of the century, Hearst was no longer just a publisher. He was a presence. His papers reached millions. His opinions echoed through politics, culture, and foreign policy. He entered Congress not because he needed office, but because it extended his reach. He did not separate journalism from power. To him, they were the same instrument. Yet beneath the expansion, something remained unresolved. His influence was immediate but temporary. Newspapers were consumed and discarded daily. Headlines faded. Public attention moved on. No matter how dominant his voice became, it did not feel permanent. The castles of Europe returned to his thoughts. He had wealth that rivaled nobility. He had influence that rivaled governments. But he lacked something tangible that would endure without explanation. He did not want to be remembered only in print. He wanted something that could be seen, touched, and inhabited, something that would force future generations to acknowledge his existence. This desire did not emerge suddenly. It had been forming since childhood, but it would take a personal catalyst to transform it into action. That catalyst arrived in the form of love. Marion Davies entered his life not as a calculated alliance, but as an emotional disruption. She was young, lively, and unguarded. Unlike the social elites who surrounded Hearst, she did not compete with him intellectually or politically. She softened him. She laughed easily. She brought warmth into a life built on dominance. Their relationship unfolded quietly at first, then openly. Society disapproved. His wife refused divorce. But Hearst did not retreat. He did not conceal Marion. He installed her at the center of his private world. She became the emotional anchor around which his later ambitions would orbit. When his mother died in 1919, the final piece fell into place. Phoebe left him not just money, but land. Vast stretches of California coastline at San Simeon. Land he remembered from childhood camping trips. Hills that overlooked the Pacific. A landscape that felt untouched, elevated, separate. For Hearst, this was not simply inheritance. It was opportunity. He did not envision a house. He envisioned a statement. A place that combined the permanence of European architecture with the scale of American wealth. A structure that could not be ignored or replicated. A visible answer to the question that had followed him since boyhood. What does power leave behind? With that question unresolved, and the land finally his, William Randolph Hearst began the process that would consume nearly 3 decades of his life. Not by drawing blueprints himself, not by limiting scope, but by reaching for someone capable of turning obsession into structure. The dream was no longer abstract. It had found its hill. The letter was brief, almost deceptively casual. William Randolph Hearst did not announce a vision or outline a master plan. He wrote to Julia Morgan as if he were asking for a modest favor. He said he wanted to build a little something up on the hill at San Simeon. He mentioned that he was getting older and no longer wanted to camp in tents. On paper, it sounded practical, temporary, even restrained. But nothing in Hearst's life had ever followed restraint, and Julia Morgan understood that immediately. When she first visited the site, the scale of the challenge became clear. The hill rose more than 1,600 feet above the Pacific Ocean. There were no paved roads, no electricity, no water lines. No infrastructure of any kind. The terrain was steep, exposed, and isolated. Winds swept in from the ocean. Fog rolled across the ridges without warning. From an engineering perspective, it was hostile. From Hearst's perspective, it was perfect. This isolation was not a flaw. It was the point. The hill separated the future estate from ordinary life. Anyone who reached the top would do so intentionally. The journey itself would establish hierarchy. Visitors would arrive not casually, but deliberately, aware that they were entering a controlled world. Julia Morgan did not hesitate. She had built in difficult conditions before. She had rebuilt San Francisco after fire and earthquake. She understood reinforced concrete, logistics, and long-term structural planning better than most of her peers. She also understood Hearst, or rather, she understood how to work with men like him. She listened carefully. She rarely argued. She translated ambition into systems. Construction began not with walls or towers, but with fundamentals. Roads had to be carved into the hillside. Switchbacks were engineered so trucks could climb without tipping. Stone, lumber, cement, and steel had to be hauled upward piece by piece. Workers were housed on site. Generators were installed to produce power long before any public electrical grid reached the area. Water was piped in from distant springs through miles of rugged terrain. These early years were invisible to future visitors, but they were decisive. Hearst was not building a house. He was building an independent organism. San Simeon would function as its own small city, capable of sustaining hundreds of people at once. This self-sufficiency reflected Hearst's worldview. Dependence was weakness. Control required autonomy. As infrastructure took shape, Hearst's imagination accelerated. He sent Morgan photographs, sketches, and clippings from European architecture books, Spanish cathedrals, Italian palazzi, French monasteries. He wanted towers, courtyards, arcades, and terraces. He wanted something that felt ancient without being copied outright. It was not about replication. It was about resonance. Hearst changed his mind constantly. A room that had been approved one week would be expanded the next. Towers grew taller, wings were added, features multiplied. Julia Morgan responded by redrawing plans. Again and again. Over the course of the project, she would produce more than 10,000 drawings. each revision absorbed into the next without complaint. The first completed structures were not the main house. They were guest cottages, 3 of them. Each one designed as a self-contained residence with its own personality, orientation, and view. Casa del Mar faced the ocean. Casa del Monte looked toward the mountains. Casa del Sol captured the sun. These were not temporary accommodations. They were lavish, fully furnished estates filled with European antiques, tapestries, carved ceilings, and imported tile. By 1922, these guest houses were complete. Hearst and Marion Davies moved in immediately, even as construction continued all around them. Dust filled the air, workers moved constantly, cranes and scaffolding framed the horizon. But life on the hill began anyway. From the start, San Simeon was social. Hearst did not build in solitude. He invited writers, actors, politicians, editors, and executives. Weekends became events. Guests arrived from Los Angeles by train, then by car, winding through miles of ranch land before ascending the hill. The experience was carefully choreographed. Arrival mattered. While guests admired the cottages, the true project loomed above them. Casa Grande, the main house, the core of Hearst's vision. It rose slowly, deliberately, its reinforced concrete skeleton hidden beneath limestone and marble facades. The twin bell towers became visible from miles away, white against the blue of sea and sky. Inside, scale dominated everything. Ceilings soared, hallways stretched, rooms unfolded in sequence, each one more elaborate than the last. Hearst imported entire architectural elements from Europe. Stone fireplaces, carved ceilings, doorways, windows. Some were centuries old. They arrived by ship, then by rail, then by truck, then by hand. When they reached the hill, Hearst would ask Morgan if they could be fitted into the structure. She always found a way. The house was modern beneath its ancient skin. Electricity ran through the walls. Telephones connected rooms. Plumbing served kitchens, bathrooms, and fountains. Heating systems allowed the castle to function year-round. Hearst wanted authenticity without inconvenience. He wanted history, but he wanted it comfortable. As the estate expanded, so did its staff. Hundreds of workers labored on the hill, stonemasons from Italy, tile artisans from Spain and Mexico, carpenters, engineers, electricians, gardeners. The workforce operated continuously. Construction did not pause for seasons or celebrations. Perfection demanded persistence. Hearst monitored progress obsessively. He reviewed drawings, he walked the site, he issued instructions late at night, he demanded changes mid-construction. For Julia Morgan, the challenge was not technical alone, it was psychological. She had to absorb Hearst's shifting desires without losing structural coherence. The castle could not become chaotic. Every addition had to support the whole. One of the most visible expressions of Hearst's obsession was water. He built not one pool, but 2. The Neptune pool was placed outdoors on a terrace overlooking the ocean. Marble columns framed the water. Classical statues lined the edges. The pool shimmered under the California sun, heated so it could be used year-round. It functioned as spectacle. Guests swam while photographers watched. The pool became an image, a symbol. Inside Casa Grande, the Roman pool offered something different, enclosed, intimate, and overwhelming. The walls and ceiling were covered in more than 1 million tiny glass tiles, deep blue and gold. Underwater lighting made the space glow. Reflections danced across the surface. It felt sacred rather than recreational, a chamber rather than a pool. As San Simeon gained notoriety, it became more than a residence. It became a destination. Hollywood figures arrived seeking favor. Politicians arrived seeking influence. Writers arrived seeking inspiration. Hearst controlled the environment completely. Schedules were fixed. Meals were mandatory. Alcohol was limited. These rules were not arbitrary. They were mechanisms of order. Marion Davies became the emotional center of this world. She hosted, she entertained, she softened the formality. Guests adored her warmth. She made the castle feel human. Yet beneath her laughter, strain grew. Her dependence on alcohol deepened quietly. Hearst noticed. He tried to control it through rules, through limits, through protection. Control was his instinctive response to fear. The parties continued. Film screenings in the private theater, tennis matches, late-night conversations under chandeliers and tapestries. The zoo expanded. Exotic animals roamed the hills. Zebras grazed beside roads, giraffes stretched their necks toward trees, lions roared at night. Guests spoke of the experience in hushed tones. It felt unreal, untouchable, but construction never stopped. Even as Casa Grande neared completion, Hearst kept adding terraces, fountains, gardens, new wings. The project resisted finality. Completion would imply satisfaction. Hearst was not interested in satisfaction. He was interested in continuation. Financially, the scale was staggering. Maintaining the estate required enormous resources. Hundreds of employees, constant shipments, continuous repairs. Hearst absorbed the cost without hesitation. Money, to him, was fuel. And he believed his reserves were endless. They were not. As the 1,920 seconds ended, the world shifted. The stock market collapsed. Advertising revenue declined. Newspapers struggled. Hearst's empire, built on expansion and leverage, began to strain. Yet even as pressure mounted, he refused to stop. Construction continued. Collecting continued. Spending continued. San Simeon stood at the peak of its glamour as the foundations beneath Hearst's fortune began to crack. The hilltop still glowed at night. Laughter still echoed through the halls. But the balance between dream and reality was shifting. Hearst had succeeded in building a world apart. He had created something no American had attempted at that scale. A castle that merged European memory with American ambition. But in doing so, he tied his identity completely to its existence. The hill had become more than a site. It had become a mirror. The illusion of permanence began to fracture quietly, almost politely, before it collapsed. There was no single moment when William Randolph Hearst acknowledged that the scale of his dream had outrun reality. Instead, the pressure arrived incrementally. A delayed payment here, a renegotiated loan there. Advertising revenues softened. Circulation numbers fluctuated. These were not unfamiliar problems, but this time, they did not resolve themselves. Hearst had built his empire on expansion. When one paper faltered, he bought another. When criticism mounted, he increased volume. When markets shifted, he pushed harder. That strategy had worked for decades because growth masked vulnerability. As long as the system expanded, debt appeared manageable. But by the late 1,920 seconds, expansion no longer guaranteed control. The Great Depression did not announce itself dramatically to Hearst at first. It crept into his ledgers. Advertising budgets shrank. Companies that once competed for full-page spreads pulled back. Newspapers remained essential, but profit margins narrowed. Hearst's operations were vast and expensive. Printing plants, staff salaries, distribution networks, radio ventures, film interests. Each component depended on continuous cash flow. San Simeon remained insulated at first. Construction continued. Staff remained in place. Guests still arrived. Hearst refused to let the hill reflect weakness. To stop building would have been to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability was unacceptable. The castle was not just a residence, it was proof of command. Behind the scenes, however, the numbers grew impossible to ignore. Hearst's spending habits had never been cautious. He purchased art compulsively, often entire architectural elements stripped from European buildings, ceilings, doorways, fireplaces, statues. Some arrived at the hill. Others were stored in warehouses in New York and California, unopened but fully paid for. Ownership mattered more than use. Possession itself was reassurance. By the early 1,930 seconds, Hearst's debt had reached levels that even he could not easily obscure. Banks began to scrutinize accounts that had once been trusted implicitly. Loans that were routinely renewed now required justification. Credit tightened. The system that had enabled his rise now demanded restraint. Hearst did not adapt easily to restraint. He attempted to outspend the downturn, convinced that momentum itself could carry him through. Construction at San Simeon continued even as newspapers struggled. He believed the economy would rebound quickly, as it had after previous panics. This time, it did not. The depression deepened. Unemployment soared. Public sentiment shifted. Excess became suspect. The image of San Simeon, once admired as grandeur, began to feel out of step with the national mood. A private zoo, marble pools, imported tapestries. To many Americans, it looked like indulgence at a moment of widespread hardship. Hearst's newspapers tried to navigate this tension, but the contrast was unavoidable. By 1935, Hearst's financial position was no longer a private matter. Creditors demanded intervention. Banks imposed oversight. The Hearst Corporation was effectively placed under external control. Hearst retained his title, but decision-making authority slipped away. For a man who had built his identity around command, this loss was devastating. The first major casualty was construction. In 1937, Hearst issued the order he had resisted for nearly 3 decades. All work at San Simeon was to stop immediately. No exceptions, no delays. The message traveled up the hill quickly. Workers packed tools. Scaffolding remained where it stood. Materials were left in place. The sound of hammers and saws vanished. The castle was unfinished. It would remain that way forever. For the first time since construction began, the hill fell quiet. Fountains slowed. Some gardens were left untended. The workforce was reduced to a small crew tasked only with maintenance. Hearst did not return to oversee adjustments or revisions. The place that had embodied his control now reflected his limits. He retreated to Los Angeles, taking residence at one of his other estates. San Simeon was left behind, not sold, not abandoned, but suspended. It stood intact, magnificent, but strangely incomplete. Towers reached skyward without final embellishments. Rooms waited for furnishings that never arrived. Blueprints sat, rolled, and unused. Marion Davies remained by Hearst's side throughout this collapse. While public narratives framed her as a beneficiary of excess, privately she became his support system. She had saved and invested wisely over the years, independent of Hearst's finances. When his accounts were frozen, she quietly offered her own money to stabilize operations. Nearly $1 million. No conditions, no publicity. Her contribution was not symbolic. It kept newspapers running. It prevented forced sales. It bought time. Hearst accepted her help with a mixture of gratitude and humiliation. He had always been the provider. Now he was being sustained. Their relationship, long criticized and misunderstood, revealed its depth during these years. Marion did not leave when the glamour faded. She did not withdraw when influence diminished. She stayed. San Simeon, meanwhile, became a symbol of contradiction. It was still astonishing to look at, still unmatched in scale, but it no longer represented progress. It represented arrest. A dream interrupted mid-sentence. The private zoo was dismantled. Exotic animals were relocated to public parks and sanctuaries. What had once astonished guests now felt impractical. Without large staffs and constant care, the illusion could not be maintained. The hill lost its wildness first. Zebras disappeared. Lions no longer roared at night. Inside the castle, rooms remained furnished but unused. Dust settled. Tapestries hung silently. Chandeliers were lit less often. The life that had animated the space withdrew gradually, leaving architecture without purpose. For Hearst, this withdrawal was personal. He had not simply built a house. He had externalized his identity. The castle had been a manifestation of his ambition, his taste, his authority. To see it quiet was to confront his own decline. As if financial collapse were not enough, Hearst faced a different kind of assault on his legacy. In 1941, a film was released that would permanently alter how the public perceived him. A fictional story, thinly disguised, about a powerful newspaper tycoon whose ambition isolated him and destroyed his happiness. The film was called Citizen Kane. Hearst recognized himself immediately. The mansion Xanadu mirrored San Simeon. The protagonist's relationship with a younger woman mirrored his own with Marion. The themes of control, loneliness, and obsession struck too close to home. Hearst did not treat the film as art or satire. He treated it as attack. He responded with the tools he knew best. He banned advertising for the film across his newspapers. He ordered editors to denounce its creator. He pressured theaters and studios. For a time, his influence succeeded. The film struggled commercially. Its release was limited. But suppression could not erase impact. Over time, Citizen Kane gained recognition as a landmark in cinema. Hearst's attempt to silence it became part of its mythology. Ironically, the film outlived the power he used against it. For Marion Davies, the damage was personal. The film's portrayal of the female character painted her as untalented and dependent. Audiences assumed the caricature was accurate. Davies, who was intelligent, generous, and capable, found her reputation reduced to fiction. She did not publicly attack the film. She absorbed the misunderstanding quietly. Hearst, already weakened, withdrew further from public life. His health declined. He spent his final years moving between residences, rarely traveling long distances. He refused to return to San Simeon. Officially, the journey was too taxing. Unofficially, the hill reminded him of a self he could no longer sustain. He asked for photographs instead, images of the towers, the pools, the terraces. He studied them silently. The castle existed for him now, only as memory and representation, not experience. When he died in 1947, the newspapers announced it quickly. The same presses he had controlled for decades printed his obituary. Assessments varied: visionary, tyrant, innovator, manipulator. Few denied his influence. None could ignore it. San Simeon lowered its flags. After his death, the estate entered a new phase. It no longer belonged to a living vision, it became inheritance, responsibility, burden. The family did not return to live there. The scale was too great, the identity too specific. Without Hearst, the castle lacked narrative momentum. For years, it stood largely unchanged. Caretakers preserved it. The state of California eventually accepted it as a donation, transforming a private obsession into a public monument. What had been built to assert control now existed to be interpreted. Visitors would later walk the halls, admire the pools, photograph the terraces. They would hear stories of excess, artistry, and ambition. But the deeper story lingered beneath the surface. A story about a man who tried to make permanence tangible, who tried to outbuild impermanence itself. The castle endured. The certainty that built it did not. What remained after the noise faded was something quieter, heavier, and more difficult to define. San Simeon did not collapse when William Randolph Hearst left it behind. It did not decay into ruin. It did not vanish into memory. It stood exactly as it was, monumental and unresolved, suspended between past ambition and uncertain purpose. In many ways, that suspension became the final chapter of Hearst's story, even while he was still alive. After construction stopped in 1937, the castle entered a strange half-life. It was no longer growing, but it was not finished. It was no longer hosting crowds, but it was not abandoned. A reduced staff remained on the hill, tasked with preservation rather than creation. Their work was quiet and repetitive, dusting tapestries, polishing floors, maintaining plumbing and electrical systems designed for hundreds of people, but now serving only a handful. The silence changed the meaning of the space. Rooms that had once pulsed with conversation now amplified every footstep. The grand assembly hall, built to impress guests, felt cavernous when empty. The refectory table stretched endlessly without diners. Chairs remained perfectly aligned, waiting for occupants who would never return. The castle became less a home and more an artifact. Hearst followed its condition from a distance. He asked for reports. He requested photographs. He issued occasional instructions, but he no longer intervened. The authority that had once defined him was now abstract. He could imagine changes, but he could not enact them. For a man whose identity had been built on action, this passivity was a quiet torment. In Los Angeles, life contracted. His circle grew smaller. Political influence waned. Newspapers continued to operate, but without the aggression that had once defined them. Hearst still read proofs, still marked corrections, but the scale had diminished. He was no longer shaping the national conversation. He was responding to it. Marion Davies remained present, attentive, and loyal. Their relationship, stripped of glamour and spectacle, became domestic in its own way. They spent evenings together reading, listening to music, watching films. The intensity of earlier years softened into companionship. Yet beneath this calm was the awareness that something irreplaceable had ended. San Simeon had been their shared world. Without it, they lived in fragments. The release of Citizen Kane cast a long shadow over these years. Even as Hearst retreated from public confrontation, the film continued to circulate. Critics praised it. Filmmakers studied it. Audiences rediscovered it. The version of Hearst, presented on screen, fictional yet familiar, began to dominate cultural memory. The irony was unavoidable. A man who had controlled narrative for decades was now being defined by one he could not suppress. Marion suffered quietly from this shift. She became associated with a caricature that erased her generosity, intelligence, and resilience. Roles diminished, public perception hardened. Yet she did not attempt to rewrite the story. She accepted misrepresentation with a dignity that contrasted sharply with the noise surrounding it. As Hearst's health declined, the distance between him and San Simeon became permanent. He refused to make the journey again. Officially, doctors advised against it. Unofficially, the hill no longer reflected who he was. The castle had been built as an extension of power. Returning without power would have felt like failure. When he died in 1947, the reaction was swift but measured. The era he represented had already ended. Industrial titans were no longer admired uncritically. Media power was being reassessed. Hearst's death felt less like a shock and more like a closing bracket. At San Simeon, caretakers observed a moment of stillness. Flags were lowered. The Pacific wind moved through cypress trees planted decades earlier. The castle absorbed the news without ceremony. It had outlasted its creator. That endurance was both its triumph and its burden. In the years that followed, the Hearst family faced a decision. The estate was too large, too expensive, too bound to a single personality to function as a private residence. No one could inhabit it without being overshadowed by the man who built it. Selling it intact was impractical. Dismantling it would have been sacrilege. Preservation became the only viable option. In 1958, the family donated the estate, along with its contents and surrounding land, to the state of California. What had once been a private declaration of power became a public responsibility. The transition altered the castle's meaning again. It was no longer an assertion, it was an exhibit. As a museum, San Simeon took on a new role. Visitors arrived not as guests, but as observers. They followed guided paths. They heard curated narratives. They moved through spaces once restricted to the powerful. The castle became accessible, but also contextualized. Its excess was explained rather than celebrated. People marveled at the Neptune pool. They whispered beneath chandeliers. They admired tapestries woven centuries earlier. But they also sensed something else: a tension between beauty and isolation, grandeur and loneliness. The castle was flawless in detail, yet emotionally incomplete. This incompleteness became part of its legacy. Unlike European castles shaped by generations, San Simeon belonged to one man's vision. When that vision ended, growth stopped. The castle did not evolve, it froze. That stillness preserved Hearst's ambition exactly as it was at the moment it became unsustainable. Julia Morgan's role gained greater recognition over time. As architectural history reassessed the estate, her achievement became undeniable. She had not simply executed instructions. She had solved problems at a scale rarely attempted. She had balanced fantasy with engineering, excess with stability. The castle survived earthquakes, storms, and decades of neglect because of her discipline. Her legacy expanded beyond San Simeon. Hundreds of buildings across California bore her influence, yet the castle remained her most visible work, even though it was never hers in name or narrative. She had turned obsession into structure and then stepped aside. For Marion Davies, life after Hearst was quiet. She withdrew from public attention. She did not remarry. She preserved memories privately, refusing to exploit them. Her loyalty to Hearst outlasted scandal, criticism, and loss. In the end, she lived without the spectacle that had once defined her role. San Simeon continued to receive visitors. Millions over the decades. Each brought their own interpretation. Some saw excess, some saw artistry, some saw warning. The castle allowed all readings. It did not instruct, it endured. What makes San Simeon extraordinary is not simply its scale or luxury. It is the clarity with which it exposes a human impulse. The desire to leave something undeniable behind, to convert ambition into matter, to make existence visible across time. Hearst believed permanence could be built. In a way, he was right. The castle still stands. Its towers still rise above the Pacific. Its pools still reflect light. Its halls still echo. But permanence came at a cost. The cost of flexibility. The cost of completion. The cost of peace. San Simeon did not become eternal because it was finished. It became eternal because it stopped. And in that stillness, it tells the final truth of its maker. Not that power lasts, not that wealth protects, but that the desire to be remembered can shape landscapes long after the voice that commanded them falls silent. By the time San Simeon opened to the public, the world that had produced it was already distant. The Gilded Age mentality that rewarded unchecked expansion, personal empires, and public spectacle had given way to regulation, skepticism, and restraint. Visitors arrived not to witness power in action, but to study its remains. The castle became less a living place and more a preserved psychology, an architectural record of how ambition once operated when few limits existed. Walking through the estate, guides spoke of square footage, imported ceilings, and famous guests. But beneath those facts was a quieter narrative that visitors often sensed without being told. The castle was overwhelming, but not comforting, beautiful, but not warm. It offered admiration without intimacy. This emotional distance was not accidental. It reflected the worldview of the man who built it. Hearst believed in control above all else. Control of information, control of space, control of narrative. San Simeon was designed to reinforce that control physically. Guests followed schedules. Meals were mandatory. Movement was guided. Even leisure occurred within defined boundaries. The castle functioned like a newsroom, translated into stone, structured, hierarchical, precise. This rigidity created order, but it also limited adaptability. When Hearst's power weakened, the castle could not adjust. It could not shrink, repurpose, or transform organically. Its systems were too large, too specific. The very scale that made it impressive made it fragile. As decades passed, preservation efforts focused on freezing the estate in its last active state. Restoration did not aim to modernize. It aimed to maintain. Paint colors were matched precisely. Textiles were cleaned but not replaced. Mechanical systems were stabilized rather than upgraded. The goal was not comfort, but accuracy. Accuracy preserved contradictions. Visitors could stand beside a Roman statue overlooking the Pacific and feel awe, then step into a bedroom and sense loneliness. They could admire craftsmanship while noticing unused space. The castle revealed excess without resolution. It showed what happens when ambition is uninterrupted by reflection. Unlike European palaces that evolved across generations, San Simeon remained singular. One vision, one era, one personality. That singularity made it powerful as a historical artifact, but uninhabitable as a living space. No one after Hearst could step into the role without being consumed by comparison. The estate's emptiness after donation was not neglect, it was inevitability. The staff who maintained the property understood this instinctively. They did not attempt to recreate the social life of the 1,920 They focused on conservation. The goal was to keep the castle intact, not alive. It had already lived its full life. Meanwhile, public interpretation shifted. Early visitors were fascinated by glamour and celebrity. Over time, curiosity deepened into analysis. Scholars examined the estate as a case study in American excess. Architects studied Julia Morgan's engineering solutions. Cultural historians analyzed Hearst's psychology through spatial design. The castle became a text. Every hallway suggested intention. Every courtyard suggested hierarchy. Even the placement of windows reflected power dynamics. The grandest views were reserved for public spaces. Private rooms were enclosed. Hearst's own suite was darker, heavier, more fortress-like than Marion Davies' light-filled rooms. These choices were not aesthetic accidents. They revealed internal divisions. Marion's absence lingered as strongly as Hearst's. Her warmth had animated the space. Without her presence, the castle felt colder. Visitors learned of her parties, her laughter, her role as hostess. But they experienced the estate without that humanizing influence. What remained was architecture without its emotional counterbalance. This absence shaped the castle's modern reputation. It was admired, but rarely described as inviting. Unlike other historic homes that felt domestic despite scale, San Simeon felt ceremonial. Its purpose was display, not comfort. Even at its most lively, it had been curated rather than spontaneous. Hearst's belief that permanence could be built through accumulation revealed its flaw here. Permanence requires continuity. Accumulation alone produces monument, not legacy. When accumulation stops, meaning must sustain itself. San Simeon struggled in that regard, and yet, it endured. That endurance complicates any simple judgment. The castle did what Hearst wanted it to do. It forced recognition. It refused erasure. It remained visible long after his newspapers faded and his influence dissolved. In that sense, his ambition succeeded. But endurance is not the same as fulfillment. Hearst sought immortality through stone, but immortality without participation becomes observation. People do not live in the castle, they move through it. They do not belong to it, they study it. That distance preserves structure but empties purpose. Julia Morgan's role becomes clearer when viewed through this lens. She built a system capable of lasting. She did not promise happiness or meaning. She delivered stability. Her engineering allowed the castle to survive earthquakes, weather, and time. Her restraint balanced Hearst's excess. Without her, the estate would have collapsed long before its creator. Her own legacy followed a different trajectory: quiet, functional, enduring. She did not build monuments to herself, she built buildings that served: schools, churches, institutions. Places shaped by use rather than display. In contrast to San Simeon, many of her other works remained occupied, adapted, and integrated into daily life. That contrast sharpens the castle's lesson. Power-driven architecture often resists adaptation. Service-driven architecture invites it. One endures as artifact, the other endures as function. San Simeon chose artifact. As years passed, the estate's symbolism expanded. It became shorthand for American excess, for the dangers of unchecked ambition, for the loneliness of dominance. Popular culture continued to reference it. Films, books, documentaries, each retelling emphasized different aspects, but the core remained consistent. A man tried to build permanence through control, and discovered that control could not protect against change. Visitors today often describe a feeling they cannot immediately explain. A sense of admiration mixed with unease. They marvel at craftsmanship but feel relief when leaving. This reaction is not failure. It is honesty. The castle was never meant to be comforting. It was meant to impress. Hearst understood spectacle deeply. He understood that being seen mattered more than being loved. His newspapers thrived on attention. San Simeon followed the same logic. It commanded gaze. It demanded recognition. It did not seek connection. In this way, the castle mirrors modern structures of influence. Platforms that amplify voice without grounding identity. Systems that prioritize reach over depth. The lesson remains relevant because the impulse remains unchanged. Human ambition still seeks permanence, but permanence remains elusive. San Simeon stands today not as a warning or a celebration, but as evidence. Evidence of what happens when imagination outruns limitation, when resources meet obsession, when vision lacks closure. It is beautiful. It is flawed. It is unforgettable. And perhaps that is its final achievement. The castle does not ask to be loved. It asks to be remembered. And it is. Time did not soften San Simeon. It clarified it. As the decades passed, the castle did not blend into its surroundings or fade into benign nostalgia. Instead, it grew sharper in meaning. The farther the world moved from the era that produced it, the more clearly the structure revealed what it truly was. Not a home, not even a palace in the traditional sense, but a fixed expression of one man's relationship with power, memory, and control. For many visitors, the most unsettling realization comes slowly. It is not triggered by any single room or object, but by accumulation, the repetition of scale, the endless procession of grand spaces. Room after room designed to impress rather than comfort. Eventually, admiration gives way to fatigue. The castle overwhelms, and in that overwhelm, its psychology becomes visible. San Simeon was never meant to be lived in naturally. It was meant to be managed. Every aspect of the estate reflected hierarchy. Guests were invited, scheduled, observed. Movement followed patterns. Social interaction occurred in designated spaces. Even leisure was orchestrated. The architecture did not encourage spontaneity. It rewarded compliance. This was not accidental. It mirrored the structure of Hearst's media empire, where narratives were shaped deliberately and dissent was filtered out. Hearst did not trust chaos. He trusted systems. This mistrust extended beyond people and into time itself. The castle was his attempt to impose order on impermanence. By importing fragments of European history, he surrounded himself with objects that had survived centuries. He believed that by collecting enough of them, permanence could be assembled artificially. But permanence is not cumulative. It is contextual. European castles endured because they evolved alongside the societies that supported them. San Simeon did not evolve. It accumulated. That difference matters. As American culture shifted in the mid-20th century, the castle remained static. It did not adapt to new values of efficiency, transparency, or restraint. It could not. Its identity was too tightly bound to a single worldview. What once signaled dominance now suggested excess. What once conveyed confidence now implied insecurity. This shift altered how Hearst himself was remembered. During his lifetime, he was feared, admired, and resented. After his death, distance allowed reinterpretation. Historians examined his role in shaping public opinion. Critics reevaluated his ethics. Admirers acknowledged his innovation while questioning his methods. San Simeon became central to these reassessments, not because it explained everything, but because it explained enough. The castle did not lie. It revealed. It revealed a man who equated scale with significance, who believed that if something was large enough, visible enough, expensive enough, it would matter indefinitely. That belief drove both his success and his undoing. It allowed him to dominate media markets. It also prevented him from recognizing limits. In many ways, San Simeon was his final headline. Too large to ignore, too complex to summarize, impossible to retract. Marion Davies' legacy continued to be disentangled from fiction over time. Biographers and historians worked to correct the narrative shaped by Citizen Kane. They revealed her intelligence, her generosity, her loyalty. They documented her philanthropy and her quiet strength during Hearst's decline. As her story regained dimension, the emotional texture of the castle shifted slightly. Visitors could imagine laughter again, warmth, humanity. But that warmth remained hypothetical. It could not be restored physically. Julia Morgan's reputation, by contrast, continued to rise. As architectural history expanded to include overlooked contributors, her achievements were re-examined and celebrated. Scholars emphasized her technical mastery, her discipline, her ability to translate vision into reality without ego. San Simeon became evidence not of extravagance alone, but of engineering brilliance. The castle stood because she made it stand. This reframing did not redeem Hearst, nor did it condemn him outright. It complicated him, and complication is the truest form of legacy. The castle's role as a public site reinforced this complexity. Unlike monuments built to glorify, San Simeon invited scrutiny. It did not tell visitors what to think. It presented itself fully and allowed interpretation. Some left inspired, some disturbed, some reflective. The estate absorbed all reactions without resistance. That openness is paradoxical. The structure was built to control perception, yet it ultimately surrendered control over meaning. Hearst could dictate headlines. He could not dictate memory. Modern visitors often compare San Simeon to contemporary symbols of wealth and influence, corporate headquarters, mega estates, digital empires. The parallels are uncomfortable. The impulse to dominate attention remains. The desire to leave visible marks persists. What has changed is speed. Hearst built slowly, over decades. Today, empires rise and fall in years. San Simeon's endurance challenges that acceleration. It reminds viewers that scale without sustainability eventually isolates itself. That influence without adaptability becomes obsolete. That permanence cannot be forced, only earned through relevance. The castle does not preach this lesson, it embodies it. Even preservation has limits. Conservation teams work continuously to maintain the estate, but they do not attempt to complete it. Unfinished elements remain unfinished. Missing features are not added. The goal is fidelity, not fulfillment. This decision honors the truth of the structure. It was never completed because completion was never the point. Hearst was driven by continuation, not conclusion. The act of building mattered more than the finished product. As long as construction continued, his identity remained active. When it stopped, his identity fractured. This insight reframes the entire project. San Simeon was not meant to be finished because finishing would have required satisfaction. Satisfaction would have required acceptance. Acceptance was incompatible with Hearst's psychology. The castle, therefore, stands as a frozen process. A work perpetually in progress, halted only by external force. That suspension gives it power. It captures ambition mid-stride, uncorrected and unfulfilled. In this sense, San Simeon is less about wealth than about momentum. It shows what happens when momentum is never questioned, when growth becomes identity, when stopping feels like death. Hearst did not fail because he dreamed too big. He failed because he did not know how to stop dreaming. And yet, the castle's existence complicates the idea of failure. It stands. It attracts millions. it generates revenue, it educates, it inspires, it warns, it endures. By many measures, it succeeded. Perhaps the truth lies in contradiction. San Simeon is both triumph and caution, achievement and excess, art and artifact. It reminds us that human ambition is not inherently destructive. It becomes destructive when it refuses reflection, when it mistakes accumulation for meaning, when it confuses permanence with control. Standing on the terrace today, looking out over the Pacific, the view remains unchanged. The ocean moves endlessly, waves break and retreat, fog rolls in and lifts. Nature persists without concern for legacy. Against that vast continuity, the castle feels both monumental and fragile. Hearst once called the ocean his front yard. The phrase revealed his mindset. Ownership extended to horizon. But the ocean never belonged to him. It simply existed. San Simeon exists now in the same way. It no longer belongs to Hearst. It belongs to time. And time, unlike power, cannot be commanded. Long after the last blueprint was rolled away and the last guest departed, San Simeon continued to exert a gravitational pull, not on people who sought luxury, but on those who sensed unfinished meaning. The castle did not resolve itself neatly into a moral or a myth. Instead, it remained open-ended, inviting reflection rather than conclusion. That quality is what has allowed it to persist in the cultural imagination long after other symbols of wealth faded into irrelevance. As the 20th century progressed, America's relationship with power shifted. Industrial titans were no longer treated as near-mythic figures. Journalism, once dominated by personalities like Hearst, became institutionalized. Regulation replaced bravado. Transparency replaced spectacle. Against this backdrop, San Simeon began to look less like aspiration and more like anomaly. Yet, anomalies matter. They expose systems at their extremes. They reveal what happens when unchecked belief is given unlimited resources. San Simeon stands as a boundary marker, the outer edge of a particular American impulse. It shows how far ambition can go before it begins to undermine itself. The castle's isolation amplified this effect. Unlike estates embedded within cities or social ecosystems, San Simeon stood apart. It was not integrated into community life. It did not rely on surrounding towns for labor or culture. Everything flowed inward, upward, toward the hill. That inward gravity mirrored Hearst's worldview. Influence moved toward him. Control radiated from him. The hill was the apex. But apexes are unstable positions. They offer visibility, but little support. Once the structures beneath them weaken, there is nowhere else to go. Visitors today often notice how the castle resists personalization. There are few signs of daily life, no clutter, no improvisation. Bedrooms feel staged. Living spaces feel ceremonial. This was not oversight, it was intention. Hearst wanted control over narrative, even in private. Personal messiness threatened image. Order preserved authority. The cost of that order was intimacy. Even during its most active years, San Simeon functioned more like a court than a home. Guests were entertained, but rarely relaxed. Schedules ruled. Protocol mattered. The environment encouraged admiration rather than belonging. That atmosphere reinforced Hearst's position, but it also isolated him. True companionship requires vulnerability. Vulnerability was not permitted on the hill. Marion Davies came closest to bridging that gap. Her humor and warmth softened the edges. She created moments of genuine ease within a rigid structure, yet even she could not fully dissolve the hierarchy. Her role was permitted, not equal. That imbalance weighed on her privately, even as she fulfilled expectations publicly. After Hearst's death, the absence of hierarchy changed how the space was perceived. Without a central authority, the structure felt strangely hollow. Its systems had been designed around one presence. Remove that presence, and the logic faltered. This is why the castle could not be repurposed organically. It lacked the flexibility to accommodate new identities. Attempts to imagine alternative uses surfaced periodically. Private retreat, luxury hotel, government facility. None gained traction. Each proposal collapsed under the same reality. The estate was too specific, too personal, too monumental to serve anything but memory. Preservation therefore became an act of honesty. Rather than forcing relevance, caretakers chose to preserve truth. The castle would remain what it was, a record, not a reinvention. That decision allowed deeper engagement. Scholars examined how architecture encodes power. Psychologists analyzed the relationship between accumulation and insecurity. Cultural critics explored the tension between American ideals of mobility and the European fixation on permanence. San Simeon became a multidisciplinary case study, not just a tourist attraction. Its influence extended quietly into contemporary discourse. Discussions about media power often reference Hearst implicitly. The dangers of narrative dominance, the temptation to shape reality rather than report it. San Simeon looms in those conversations as physical evidence of what happens when influence goes unexamined. The castle also challenges modern assumptions about success. In a culture that celebrates growth, scale, and visibility, San Simeon asks an uncomfortable question. When is enough actually enough? Hearst never answered that question. He deferred it indefinitely. The castle deferred it physically. In contrast, the natural world surrounding the estate continues without deferral. The Pacific shifts. Weather erodes cliffs. Vegetation adapts. The land responds to time fluidly, not defensively. Against this backdrop, the castle's rigidity feels intentional and artificial. It stands in opposition to the environment rather than in harmony with it. This opposition heightens its drama. The white towers against blue sky, marble against earth, geometry against horizon. The visual impact is undeniable, but so is the contrast. Nature does not seek permanence through preservation. It seeks continuity through change. Hearst sought permanence through accumulation. Nature demonstrates permanence through transformation. That distinction undercuts the castle's premise. No matter how solid the stone, it cannot outlast relevance. San Simeon survives because it has been recontextualized. It is relevant not as a residence, but as a lesson. Visitors leave with different interpretations, but few leave unchanged. Some feel inspired by the audacity, others feel unsettled by the excess. Many feel both. That duality is the estate's strength. It resists simplification. Simplification would flatten it into caricature. Excessive wealth, eccentric billionaire, lavish folly. Those labels miss the complexity. Hearst was not merely indulgent. He was strategic, disciplined, and deeply intentional. His flaw was not lack of intelligence, but lack of restraint. San Simeon captures that flaw without exaggeration. It does not editorialize. It presents evidence. Over time, public empathy toward Hearst has shifted. Distance allows nuance. His achievements in journalism are acknowledged. His ethical lapses are critiqued. His contradictions are accepted. The castle supports this balanced view. It neither absolves nor condemns. It contextualizes. Marion Davies' posthumous reputation has benefited from this contextualization as well. As scholarship corrected misconceptions, her role emerged with clarity. She was not a passive accessory. She was an active participant who paid a personal price. Her loyalty sustained Hearst when systems failed. Her humanity softened an otherwise rigid world. Julia Morgan's legacy continues to expand. Recognition of her work reframes San Simeon as collaboration rather than imposition. The castle becomes evidence not just of Hearst's ambition, but of Morgan's ability to channel ambition into stability. Without her, the estate would not exist as it does. That collaboration highlights a final irony. Hearst sought control, but depended entirely on others to realize it. Builders, engineers, artists, staff. San Simeon was collective labor shaped by singular will. Its endurance honors that labor even as it exposes the will that directed it. In the end, the castle stands because many people believed in making something extraordinary, even if they did not share Hearst's obsession. Their craftsmanship outlasted his certainty. San Simeon does not resolve the question of whether the dream was worth its cost. It leaves that judgment to each observer. What it does resolve is the idea that power alone can create meaning. It cannot. Meaning requires connection, adaptability, and acceptance of limits. Hearst rejected limits. The castle absorbed the consequences. Standing on the hill today, the silence feels intentional rather than empty. It allows reflection. It allows the structure to speak without interruption. What it says is not loud. It does not shout. It does not command. It endures. And in that endurance, it offers its final lesson. Not about wealth or ambition, but about the human desire to matter beyond one's lifetime. That desire is universal. How it is pursued determines whether it becomes legacy or monument. San Simeon became both. By the early 21st century, San Simeon had settled into its final identity, not as a residence, not as a symbol of living power, but as a fixed presence that refused to fade. What made it unusual was not simply that it survived, but that it survived without needing reinvention. Most monuments require reinterpretation to stay relevant. San Simeon did not. Its meaning sharpened as distance grew. The castle's continued relevance rests on a simple truth. It exposes something fundamental about ambition when it is allowed to operate without friction. Hearst did not build in opposition to society. He built with its applause. His newspapers thrived because audiences rewarded excess. His influence expanded because spectacle attracted attention. San Simeon was not a private deviation. It was the logical extension of a culture that equated scale with success. That context matters. Too often, Hearst is framed as an outlier, an eccentric titan whose excess was uniquely personal. In reality, he was deeply representative of his moment. The late 19th and early 20th centuries celebrated accumulation. Bigger factories, bigger rail networks, bigger fortunes, bigger personalities. Hearst applied that logic to information and space. Where others built skyscrapers or industrial complexes, he built narrative dominance and architecture. San Simeon was not an escape from his public life. It was its physical manifestation. The castle functioned as a closed loop. Power generated wealth, wealth generated scale, scale reinforced power. Guests who arrived at San Simeon understood immediately that they were entering an environment where hierarchy was absolute. The experience was immersive by design. Isolation removed external reference points. Grandeur replaced ordinary measures of comparison. This was not hospitality in the traditional sense. It was theater. Every detail contributed to the performance. Arrival routes were calculated, sightlines were controlled. The progression from gate to terrace to interior followed a deliberate rhythm. Guests moved from awe to submission without being instructed. The architecture did the work. That same architecture, however, lacked an essential quality. It did not allow ambiguity. There was little room for personal interpretation while the castle was active. Meaning flowed downward from Hearst. He defined the narrative. Others participated. Once he was gone, the structure lost its directive voice. What remained was raw evidence, and evidence invites scrutiny. This is why modern audiences experience San Simeon differently than Hearst's guests did. They are not being guided by authority. They are not being impressed into agreement. They are free to question, free to linger, free to notice contradictions. They notice that despite its scale, the castle lacks warmth, that despite its luxury, it feels emotionally restrained, that despite its beauty, it resists intimacy. These observations are not judgments. They are readings. The architecture communicates them silently. The castle also reveals something about fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of impermanence. Fear of being forgotten. Hearst's collecting behavior, often described as obsession, can be understood as defense. Each object acquired was a reassurance against disappearance. Each imported ceiling, each tapestry, each statue extended his presence backward into history, but borrowing history does not create lineage. European aristocracy relied on inheritance and continuity. Hearst relied on acquisition. He assembled fragments of history without belonging to their origin. San Simeon became a collage of permanence rather than a product of it. This distinction explains why the castle feels timeless but not rooted. It exists outside normal historical flow, neither ancient nor modern, neither evolving nor decaying. It occupies a suspended state. That suspension is unsettling to some visitors. Humans expect places to change. Growth, decline, adaptation. San Simeon resists all three. It is preserved at the moment ambition stalled. That stasis forces confrontation. Viewers must ask why it stopped, not how it ended. The answer is not collapse, but saturation. Hearst reached the limit of what expansion could provide. Beyond that point, growth no longer produced meaning. It only amplified strain. His health declined. His influence waned. The system he built demanded more energy than he could supply. The castle reflects that exhaustion. It is impressive, but heavy. Monumental, but burdened. It does not invite continuation. It signals conclusion. This is why no successor could inhabit it. San Simeon was not transferable. It did not offer a framework for renewal. It offered finality. In this sense, the castle resembles a closed argument, perfectly articulated, completely defended, and ultimately unable to respond. Modern power structures face a similar risk. Platforms grow until they dominate discourse. Corporations expand until they strain systems. Individuals accumulate influence until maintenance eclipses creativity. San Simeon illustrates this trajectory physically. It shows what happens when scale becomes self-justifying. The estate's educational value lies here, not in its opulence, but in its limits. Preservationists understand this. They do not attempt to romanticize Hearst or vilify him. They present the site as it is, letting complexity stand without simplification. This restraint respects the intelligence of the viewer. It also honors the labor embedded in the structure. Thousands of craftsmen, engineers, artists, and workers contributed to the castle. Their skill transcended Hearst's intentions. Stone was laid with care. Tile was set with precision. Systems were engineered to last. Their work remains visible long after the ambition that commissioned it faded. In that sense, San Simeon is also a monument to collaboration. Even when driven by singular will, large creations depend on collective effort. That effort outlasts individual ego. The natural environment continues to assert itself subtly. Fog softens edges. Light shifts across terraces. Plants reclaim corners. These changes are slow, but constant. They remind visitors that time operates independently of human desire. Hearst tried to control time by freezing it. Nature responds by eroding control gradually. Neither force wins completely. The castle stands. The landscape moves. That tension defines the experience. Visitors leave with more questions than answers. Was Hearst a visionary or a warning? Was San Simeon a triumph or a trap? Did ambition create beauty or consume it? The castle refuses to decide. It holds all interpretations simultaneously. That refusal is its final strength. In a world eager for simple narratives, San Simeon remains unresolved. It resists moral clarity. It demands sustained attention. It asks observers to sit with contradiction. Hearst would likely have disliked this outcome. He preferred control over interpretation. He shaped headlines precisely to avoid ambiguity. Yet, in death, he lost that control. His greatest creation became open to meanings he could not dictate. Ironically, this openness grants the castle a kind of immortality he never planned, not as propaganda, not as celebration, but as inquiry. San Simeon continues to matter because it does not tell people what to think. It shows them what happened when power, imagination, and fear converged without restraint, and it leaves the rest to them.